He sat at dinner with his fiancée, planning their perfect wedding, until two identical little girls walked up to his table and whispered, "You're our dad." In that moment, his entire life detonated. The rooftop restaurant shimmered with soft candlelight as Brandon Hale, a 36-year-old millionaire CEO with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, sat across from his elegant fiancée, Cassandra Lowry. The evening was meant to be perfect, a celebration of their upcoming wedding, a future carefully crafted with precision and status in mind. Cassandra was glowing with satisfaction as she flipped through a glossy wedding binder, discussing floral arrangements and guest lists as though nothing in the world could disrupt her vision of the ideal life they were building. Brandon listened, or at least tried to, but his thoughts drifted in quiet intervals. He couldn't shake the odd feeling that something in the air was shifting, though he blamed it on work stress and the weight of expectations pressing down on him from every direction. He looked at Cassandra, admiring her composed beauty, her blonde curls pinned perfectly, her diamond earrings catching the light. She represented stability, refinement, and a partnership that made sense on paper, even if something deep inside him remained strangely untouched. Still, he told himself that love didn't have to be dramatic or consuming, it could be structured, predictable, mutually beneficial. Cassandra certainly believed it should be, and over time he had tried to believe it too. Their families approved. The business world approved. Everything about their relationship was right, logical, strategic. But then a soft sound of footsteps approached their table, breaking the flow of Cassandra's commentary about custom-embroidered napkins. Brandon looked up, and the world tilted. Two little girls, identical to the last freckle, stood only a few feet away. They couldn't have been more than 5 years old, dressed in matching white dresses that made them look like porcelain dolls brought to life. Their dark hair framed their small faces in loose waves, but it was their eyes that held him captive, stunning blue, the exact shade he saw in the mirror each morning. They stared at him with something between fear and hope, their small hands tightly intertwined as if sharing courage between them. Cassandra frowned at the interruption, clearly irritated, but Brandon barely registered her reaction. A strange, unexplainable pull rooted him to the moment, urging him to pay attention in a way he hadn't felt in years. One of the girls opened her mouth, hesitated, and glanced at her sister. The second squeezed her hand softly, encouraging her. Finally, in trembling unison, they said words that sliced through the air with shocking clarity. "You're our dad." The restaurant buzz softened into a dull, distant hum. Conversations faded. Even the clinking of glasses seemed to halt. Brandon felt his breath catch as if someone had reached inside him and stolen the air. Cassandra reacted instantly, her chair scraping sharply as she straightened, outrage tightening every line of her face, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from the two small figures before him. He searched their faces for understanding, for context, for anything that could make sense of this moment. Their resemblance to him was undeniable, painfully undeniable, and yet the logical part of his mind rejected the possibility outright. How could he have children? Who were they? Where was their mother? Why come to him now, here, on this night? The older of the two, by just a heartbeat, it seemed, lifted a small envelope from behind her back and held it out with trembling hands. Her lip quivered, but she didn't look away from him, even as her voice cracked. "This is for you," she said softly. "From our mom." Brandon reached for the letter without breathing, his hand shaking. Even before opening it, he could feel something familiar in the way the envelope was folded, in the softness of the paper worn at the edges, as though carried for weeks. Cassandra hissed something under her breath, but he didn't listen. When he slid his finger beneath the seal and unfolded the page inside, his world fractured completely. The handwriting was unmistakable. Amelia Gray. A name that hit him like a punch to the chest, a memory he had buried, a love he had lost, a wound he thought had scarred over long ago. The woman he once believed he might marry. The woman who had vanished from his life with no explanation he could understand at the time. His heart thundered as he read the first line, and the rest of the world disappeared. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. He gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. Cassandra's voice turned into a distant, angry buzz as he continued reading, his eyes blurring. Please take care of our girls. Our girls. The words echoed inside him like thunder, shaking everything he believed about his past, his future, and the man he thought he had become. The twins looked at him, fragile and hopeful. Cassandra looked disgusted. Brandon felt his entire life, every choice, every assumption, beginning to splinter. And in that moment, he knew nothing would ever be the same again. Brandon stared at the letter as if it might change under his gaze, as if one more second of reading might make Amelia's words soften or reshape themselves into something easier to face. But the lines remained the same, devastating, irrevocable, heartbreakingly final. His hands trembled as he folded the paper, though he wasn't aware of the movement. His mind was too busy trying to reconcile the past he thought he knew with the truth now standing in front of him in the shape of two fragile little girls. Cassandra's voice eventually pierced through his shock, sharp and incredulous, demanding explanations, accusing the children of lying, but he couldn't respond to her. His attention was glued to the twins, who now looked terrified by the tension spiraling around them. Molly's lower lip quivered as she tugged nervously at the bow on her dress, while May took a tiny step forward, as though she felt the responsibility to protect her sister despite being just as frightened. The restaurant staff watched the scene from a distance, unsure whether to intervene, but Brandon forced himself to breathe and knelt so he could meet the girls at eye level. He didn't know what to say, not when his voice felt trapped behind a knot of grief and disbelief. But he also knew he couldn't let them feel abandoned in this moment. How did you find me?" he managed, his voice unsteady. May held out a worn card with his corporate address printed in bold silver letters. "Mom kept this," she whispered. "She said if something bad ever happened, we had to find you because you'd help us. She made us practice saying your name so we'd be brave." Brandon felt something shatter inside him at the image of Amelia preparing her daughters to survive without her. He swallowed hard, fighting the burn in his throat, while Cassandra stepped closer, her heels clicking like the punctuation of anger. "Brandon, this is absurd," she said sharply. "You cannot let yourself be manipulated like this. Anyone could have written that letter, anyone could have put your name on it. These children aren't your responsibility, and certainly not your daughters." The girls flinched at her tone. Molly hid behind May, clutching her sister's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Brandon stood abruptly, his expression hardening in a way Cassandra had rarely seen. "Not now," he said quietly, but it carried enough force to silence her. He turned back to the twins, his heart aching at the fear on their small faces. "Where is your mother now?" he asked gently, though he already suspected the answer. Molly finally found her voice. "She got sick," she whispered. "Really sick. She tried to stay with us, but she said her body was tired. Before she went to sleep forever, she told us your name. She said you'd take care of us because you're a good man." The restaurant blurred slightly as moisture filled his eyes. Amelia had believed in him even after years of silence, even after he had walked away from their relationship without understanding how deep their bond truly ran. He wondered how alone she must have felt when she realized she wouldn't live long enough to see her daughters grow up. He wondered what it had cost her to write that letter with such clarity, without bitterness or blame. As the girls waited anxiously for his reaction, Brandon forced himself to take a slow, grounding breath. "Did your mom ever tell you why she didn't come to me sooner?" he asked softly. May nodded. "She said she didn't want to make trouble for you. She said you had a big life and important things to take care of. But she always said you were kind." Cassandra scoffed loudly, unable to contain her disbelief. "Brandon, please. Are you really going to listen to this? Think logically. This is a trap, 2 kids claiming to be yours with no proof besides some sentimental letter. You owe it to yourself, and to me, to end this ridiculous scene right now. Her words struck a match in Brandon's chest. He turned to her slowly, and the coldness in his eyes made her step back unexpectedly. This isn't a scene, he said through clenched teeth. These are children. And Amelia never lied to me. Cassandra opened her mouth, but he raised a hand to stop her. Enough. He then looked at Molly and May again, and his expression softened instantly, as if a switch had flipped inside him. Do you have anyone else? He asked, fearing the answer. The girls shook their heads in unison. Just each other, Molly said quietly. And now you. Those 3 words hit him like a tidal wave. He motioned for the waiter and asked him to bring 2 chairs. The girls climbed into them slowly, still unsure whether they were welcome, but Brandon offered them a reassuring smile that came from somewhere deeper than logic or certainty. It came from instinct. He didn't understand everything yet, but something inside him, something primal and undeniable, recognized them. Even without proof, some part of him already knew the truth. He ordered them warm food, and when Molly's hand continued to shake, he helped her cut her chicken. May leaned against him slightly, as though testing whether he was real or would disappear like a dream. Cassandra watched the scene with growing fury, but for the first time, her anger no longer mattered to him. By the time dinner ended, Brandon knew one thing with absolute clarity: whatever the past held, and whatever the future demanded, he could not walk away from these children. Not after what they had lost. Not after what Amelia had trusted him with. Not after seeing the way they looked at him with cautious, desperate hope. Whether the truth was simple or complicated, whether it broke him or rebuilt him, he was already part of their story. And he would not abandon them. Brandon barely slept that night. He paced the length of his penthouse until dawn, unable to quiet the storm inside him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Molly and May standing at the edge of the restaurant table, their small hands clasped, their voices trembling as they called him Dad. Then he saw Amelia's handwriting, soft, familiar, devastating, telling him she was gone and asking him to care for the daughters he never knew existed. The weight of it pressed on him so heavily that he felt as though the walls around him had shrunk. His life, once meticulously structured, now spiraled with questions that clawed at him. How could Amelia have kept this from him? How had he not known? And, most painful of all, how had he not been there when she needed him most? By morning he felt hollow, but also driven by a desperate need for the truth. He didn't want to accuse the girls of anything, and he didn't want to blindly accept Cassandra's denial either. He needed answers grounded in something certain, something he could hold in his hands. So, before he even showered, he called the best DNA testing center in the city and scheduled an emergency appointment. His voice wavered only once when he explained the situation, but the receptionist responded with professional calmness and assured him they would handle everything discreetly. When he walked into the living room, Cassandra was waiting for him, arms folded, her expression a blend of irritation and disbelief. "You're not seriously entertaining this nonsense," she said the moment he entered. "Tell me you slept it off." Brandon stared at her, exhausted and already bracing for conflict. "I'm getting a DNA test," he said simply. Cassandra's face tightened. "Brandon, come on. You're smarter than this. 2 random children show up with a tragic little story and suddenly you're ready to throw your life away for them?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice as though reasoning with a child. "This is a scam. It's emotional manipulation. And this, us, our future, is far more important than indulging some fantasy from your past." But the more she spoke, the more his resolve solidified. "I need to know the truth," he said quietly. "If they're not mine, then fine. But if they are..." His voice trailed off, the unspoken consequences humming through the room. Cassandra scoffed as though the idea insulted her. "If they are, then what? You're just going to take in 2 kids you didn't even know existed?" Ruin our wedding? Destroy everything we've built? Her eyes flashed with anger, but beneath that anger was something colder and sharper, fear of losing control. Brandon felt something shift inside him. Her reaction wasn't the concern of a partner, it was the rage of someone whose plan was being threatened. He realized then how differently they viewed life, love, responsibility. Cassandra cared about image and stability, about their marriage's value in social and corporate spheres. But Brandon, whether he admitted it or not, had always wanted something real. Something human. Something that didn't fit neatly into a planner. He turned away from her and grabbed his keys. "I'm going to meet the girls," he said. "And then we're going to the clinic." Cassandra's voice rose behind him, sharp with panic. "Brandon, if you walk out that door, you're choosing them over me." He paused only long enough to say, "I'm choosing what's right." The taxi ride to the address the girls had given him felt longer than it should have, each street adding another layer of dread. When he arrived at the small, worn apartment building, he felt a pang of guilt. Amelia, who had once shared his dreams of travel and adventure, had lived here while raising 2 children alone. He buzzed the number they had written down, and a soft voice answered, "May speaking." When he said his name, she gasped, and the door buzzed open without hesitation. The apartment was small but lovingly kept. Drawings lined the walls, stick figures with dark hair and blue eyes, little hearts, and scribbled words like "mommy" and "us." A warmth filled the space that money couldn't replicate. Molly and May rushed to him, their faces brightening with a mixture of relief and fear, as though they hadn't been certain he would come. "We packed our things," Molly admitted shyly, pointing to 2 tiny backpacks. "Just in case you wanted us." The innocence of her words cut through him so deeply that he had to steady himself against the wall. He knelt and opened his arms, letting them crash into him with a force that felt like both forgiveness and heartbreak. "I'm here," he whispered. "And I'm not going anywhere until we know everything." They clung to him like they'd been waiting for this moment all their lives, and perhaps they had. The clinic appointment was quiet but heavy. The nurse swabbed their cheeks while the girls held Brandon's hands as though the test itself frightened them. Brandon stayed calm for their sake, though inside, anxiety twisted through him like a wire pulled too tight. The nurse promised results within 48 hours, and when they stepped out into the sunlight, the twins still didn't let go of his hands. Later that afternoon, while he bought them lunch, Molly slipped a folded note from her backpack. "This was with the letter," she said. "Mom said to give it to you when we felt safe." Brandon unfolded the small sheet of paper, and his breath caught. It was a photograph, Amelia holding the twins as newborns, exhausted but glowing with love. On the back she had written just one sentence. "They deserve everything you are." Brandon felt the ground beneath him shift again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something deeper, an awakening he hadn't realized he needed. The truth wasn't here yet, but he could already feel it pulling him closer. For the first time in years, he no longer cared about the life he had carefully built. He cared about the one he had unknowingly missed. Brandon found himself checking his phone every few minutes over the next 2 days, unable to focus on work or anything resembling normal routine. His office, usually a sanctuary of control and efficiency, felt unbearably small as he paced from window to desk and back again, replaying every memory he had of Amelia. He remembered her quiet strength, the way she laughed with her whole face, the softness she carried even when life pushed hard against her. He remembered the night they said goodbye, both of them younger and far more confused than they wanted to admit. He remembered telling himself it was the right choice for his career, that sacrifices were necessary, and that the future he was building had no room for unpredictability. Now, unpredictability had arrived in the shape of 2 little girls who looked at him with hope he didn't know how to handle. Cassandra called him repeatedly during those days, leaving increasingly frustrated voicemails demanding answers, insisting he meet with her like an adult, as she phrased it. But Brandon didn't feel like the adult in control of anything anymore. He ignored her messages, choosing instead to spend his time with Molly and May, picking them up from the neighbor who'd been watching them, buying them warm meals, listening to their stories about school and about the little games they invented to make each other feel brave after their mother died. They clung to him as if terrified he might vanish the way everything else in their lives had. Brandon made sure he didn't. The twins' presence slowly carved a permanent space in his days. He bought them small clothes that actually fit, since most of what they owned was worn and too short. He found them shoes that didn't pinch, hair ribbons in their favorite colors, and a pair of stuffed foxes they immediately named after each other. As he knelt in front of them in the department store while May twirled in a new dress, Brandon felt something warm unfurl in his chest, something like purpose, something like belonging. And yet, beneath the tenderness lurked a quiet terror. What if the test came back negative? What if he lost them again? On the third morning, the clinic called. His pulse hammered as he stared at the number. He was at the girl's apartment, helping Molly tie her shoes while May hummed to herself on the couch. He stepped into the hallway before answering, though he wasn't sure whether he wanted privacy for himself or to protect them from disappointment. "Mr. Hale," the voice said, calm and professional, "your results are ready. You may pick them up in person for confidentiality." The walk to the clinic felt endless. His heart pounded with every step, his mind swinging wildly between hope and dread. When he entered the building, the receptionist recognized him immediately and handed him a sealed envelope. He thanked her with a voice that wasn't entirely steady and walked outside before opening it. His hands shook as he tore the seal. His eyes scanned the text. The world blurred for a moment, and he had to steady himself against the wall. The results were positive. Not ambiguous. Not uncertain. Not borderline. Positive with 99.9% certainty. He was their father. The air left his lungs in a rush. Relief hit him first, sharp and overwhelming, followed by a wave of grief so heavy it bent him slightly forward. Amelia had carried this alone. She had raised their daughters with nothing but determination and love, never reaching out, never asking for help, never wanting to disrupt the life she believed he wanted more than anything. She had fought for as long as she could, then spent her final strength making sure her daughters found him. He pressed the results to his chest for a moment, letting the truth sink in. He was a father. He had been a father for 5 years without knowing it. And now he had a chance to protect, to guide, to love, everything Amelia had hoped for when she wrote that final letter. He returned to the apartment with the envelope still in his hand. The twins were at the table coloring, their feet swinging above the floor. When they saw him, they scrambled toward the door, their faces lighting up with joy that cracked him open. "Did they say something?" Molly asked, gripping his hand with both of hers. Brandon knelt, his throat tight. He opened the envelope, not needing to say the words but knowing they deserved to hear them. "You're mine," he said, his voice breaking. "Both of you. You're my daughters." Molly burst into tears first, burying her face in his neck, sobbing so hard her small body shook. May wrapped her arms around them, crying too, though more quietly, as if she didn't fully believe such a thing could be true. Brandon held them both, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had just become real. His tears mixed with theirs, but neither girl questioned it. In that moment, the three of them existed in a small universe of aching relief and overwhelming connection. When the storm of emotion eased, and the girls finally pulled back to look at him, Molly whispered a question so soft he nearly missed it. "Are you going to keep us?" He cupped their faces with trembling hands. "I'm never letting you go." The certainty in his voice surprised even him. It was instinctive, undeniable, and truer than anything he had ever said in his life. That evening, as he carried both of them to bed and watched them fall asleep curled against each other the way they always did, Brandon felt something shift inside him again. This time it wasn't fear or doubt. It was the beginning of a promise he hadn't yet spoken aloud, a promise that he would fight for them, protect them, and build a life worthy of all they had lost. And for the first time in years, the path ahead didn't scare him. It felt like the beginning of who he was meant to be. Brandon knew he needed to confront Cassandra, but he also knew the conversation would unravel everything between them. He waited until the twins were safely with Mrs. Doyle, their temporary guardian, and then returned to the apartment he once shared with his fiancée. As he stepped inside, he realized how strangely hollow the place felt, as if the walls themselves sensed the fracture forming long before he did. Cassandra was sitting on the couch with a glass of wine in hand, her posture rigid, her expression a careful blend of annoyance and expectation. She looked him over with a cool, assessing gaze, and before he could speak, she sighed and set the glass down a little too forcefully. Finally. "Do you feel better now that your little crisis is over?" she asked. Brandon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he removed the envelope containing the DNA results from his coat and placed it on the table between them. Cassandra's eyes flicked to it and then back to him with a freezing sharpness. "Tell me you didn't actually go through with it," she said. Her tone suggested she already knew the answer, and that the answer infuriated her. "I had to," Brandon replied. "This isn't something you can ignore or dismiss with a snap of your fingers. They deserve the truth. I deserve the truth." Cassandra stood abruptly, pacing a few steps as she laughed in disbelief, though there was nothing humorous in the sound. "You're unbelievable. You are letting two children manipulate you because you can't handle nostalgia or guilt over a woman you barely remember." Brandon felt a chill run down his spine. "I remember her," he said quietly. "Maybe not in the way you'd like to believe, but I remember her. And she didn't lie." He slid the results across the table toward her, and Cassandra froze. Her fingers tightened around her glass, knuckles whitening, and for a moment she didn't move. But curiosity, or fear, finally won, and she snatched the envelope, tearing it open. Her eyes scanned the page quickly, then again slower, her brows knitting together as the meaning sank in. "No," she whispered. "No, this isn't possible." Brandon watched her closely as she reread the page for a third time. He saw it then, the flicker of panic, the flash of anger, the dawning realization that everything she had tried to stop was now out of her control. Cassandra crumpled the paper in her hand, her eyes blazing. "You're really going to let this happen," she spat. "You're going to throw everything away for them. For children you didn't even know existed until 5 minutes ago. Do you have any idea what this will do to us? To your image? To our future?" Brandon felt something inside him break in a way that felt strangely liberating. For years he had molded himself into someone who fit perfectly into Cassandra's world, polished, ambitious, inoffensive, predictable. But now, with the truth of Molly and May shining through every fear and every doubt, he no longer cared about the world Cassandra represented. "Our future doesn't matter if it's built on lies," he said. "You forged the first test result. You tried to erase 2 little girls because they were inconvenient to you." Cassandra's face flushed with indignation. "I did what any reasonable woman would do. I protected our life together. I protected you from being dragged into someone else's mess. You owe me for that." Brandon stared at her, stunned by her audacity. "I don't owe you anything for deception," he said. "And they're not someone else's mess. They're my daughters." Cassandra's lips curled in disgust. "Daughters? You met them once, Brandon. Once. You're letting emotion override reason. Think about what this means: 2 traumatized children dumped onto your doorstep, no preparation, no plan, no guarantee they won't destroy your lifestyle. You will become a scandal. Your investors will panic. You will ruin everything you've worked for." Her words finally snapped something inside him. "Everything I've worked for feels empty compared to them," he said, and the truth of it rang through him like a bell. Cassandra stared at him, speechless, as if unable to comprehend that he had chosen something other than her expectations. He stepped closer, his voice quiet but sharper than she'd ever heard it. Emilia trusted me with her daughters. She believed in me even when she had every reason not to. And those girls, they looked at me like I was their entire world in a moment. I can't walk away from that. Cassandra's voice dropped to a vicious whisper. Then you're a fool. And you'll regret this. Brandon shook his head. No. For the first time in a long time, I won't. When he turned to leave, Cassandra's voice echoed after him, cold and shaking. Don't expect to come crawling back when they ruin your life. He didn't respond. The door closed behind him with a quiet finality, sealing away the life he no longer wanted. The hallway outside felt lighter, as though a long-shadowed weight had finally lifted from his chest. As he walked toward the elevator, he felt the truth settle into his heart with a calm certainty. He had lost something tonight, but he had gained something far more meaningful. He drove straight to Mrs. Doyle's home, where Molly and May were already in pajamas, curled up together on the couch. When Brandon entered, both girls looked up instantly, their eyes shining with recognition and something deeper, trust. May slid off the couch and ran to him first, wrapping her arms around his waist, followed by Molly, who clung to him silently, her face buried in his shirt. Brandon held them both, feeling the last remnants of his old life slip away as something new, fragile, and profoundly precious took its place. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was stepping into chaos. He felt like he was stepping toward the life he was always meant to have. Brandon spent the next few days in a state of emotional freefall, not because he regretted leaving Cassandra or because he feared the inevitable storm of rumors that would follow once the news leaked, but because everything in his life had shifted so dramatically that he sometimes struggled to recognize himself. Yet every moment he spent with Molly and May grounded him in a way nothing else ever had. He woke early to help them get ready for the day, braided their hair as best he could with clumsy fingers, and listened to their chatter over breakfast as though these small routines had always been part of his world. Their presence softened the sharp edges of his life, filling the empty spaces he never realized were hollow. But practical matters began piling up quickly. The girls needed stability, a home, medical checkups, school arrangements, and legal guardianship. Although Emilia's letter declared him their father, the law required more than sentiment. He had to prove he was not only biologically connected but also capable of providing a safe environment. So he met with a lawyer recommended by Mrs. Doyle, a calm woman named Patricia Morrison who carried the quiet authority of someone used to navigating complex family cases. She listened carefully as Brandon explained the situation, flipping through the DNA results and Emilia's letters. Her expression softened as she read the final message Emilia had written, her voice low when she said, "She trusted you profoundly. Most parents don't make decisions like this lightly." Patricia explained the process ahead: temporary guardianship, evaluation, official custody hearings. Brandon absorbed every word, determined to do whatever was needed. There was a moment when Patricia hesitated, tapping her pen thoughtfully against her notebook before asking, "Do you anticipate any opposition?" Brandon thought of Cassandra instantly, of the fury that had twisted her features, of the threat in her voice when he walked away. He nodded slowly. "Yes. But I'm prepared for that." Patricia studied him for a long moment and finally said, "Then we'll be ready." As Brandon navigated the beginnings of the custody process, he also found himself learning the quieter truths of the twins' lives, truths Emilia had carried alone. They had never known their father's name until the final months. They had moved several times when money grew tight. They remembered their mother's smile vividly but struggled to talk about the last weeks when her illness worsened. Molly often withdrew into silence when certain topics surfaced, while May tended to overcompensate with forced cheerfulness. Both girls slept curled together every night, seeking comfort in closeness. Brandon didn't push them to talk, instead, he gave them gentle space, letting them lead. Still, there were moments that struck him with unexpected force. One afternoon, he took them to a pediatrician for overdue checkups. While May hopped happily from tile to tile along the waiting room floor, Molly clung tightly to Brandon's sleeve, her eyes wary. When the doctor stepped into the room, Molly whispered, "Are they going to take us away?" The question hit him like a blade. He knelt in front of her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No one is taking you anywhere," he said with as much conviction as he could muster. "You're safe. I promise." She nodded, though her fear didn't vanish entirely, and he realized then how deeply loss had shaped these girls. They needed reassurance, consistency, and patience, things he was determined to give. In quieter moments, Brandon found himself reflecting on Amelia with a mix of longing and sorrow. He wondered what her final months had been like, whether she had felt scared or lonely, whether she had wished she'd made different choices. One evening, when the twins were asleep at Mrs. Doyle's, he returned to his apartment, not to see Cassandra, who had moved out, but to gather a few belongings and confront the remnants of a life he no longer recognized. The space felt sterile now, stripped of meaning, filled with expensive things that suddenly seemed shallow. On a bookshelf, behind glossy volumes about leadership and finance, he found a small wooden box he hadn't opened in years. Inside were photographs of him and Amelia, smiling on a beach, laughing over spilled paint in their first apartment, holding each other during a thunderstorm that had knocked the power out. He traced her face with his thumb, feeling the sting of all the years lost and all the words unsaid. Later that week, while walking the girls in a nearby park, Brandon realized how much joy had seeped into his life without him noticing. May ran ahead chasing pigeons, her laughter ringing through the air, while Molly walked beside him, slipping her small hand into his as naturally as if she had been doing so her entire life. "Daddy," she said softly, and even though he had heard it before, it still struck something deep inside him. He squeezed her hand gently. "Yes, sweetheart." She hesitated, looking up at him with wide, earnest eyes. "We don't have to go back to that old apartment, right? We can stay with you." He stopped walking, dropping to one knee so he could look her directly in the eyes. "You're staying with me," he said. "Forever. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Molly's face relaxed into a small, trembling smile, and she wrapped her arms around his neck. Brandon held her, feeling the enormity of her trust settle into his bones. Yet the peace of that moment didn't erase the storm gathering in the background. Cassandra had been silent since their confrontation, which worried him more than if she'd continued yelling. When she finally did reach out, it wasn't through a call or a message, it was through a headline he saw on his phone while walking home with the twins. CEO Brandon Hale entangled in paternity scandal, engagement in jeopardy. His stomach twisted. He clicked on the article, and though it didn't name Cassandra explicitly, the details were unmistakably fed by someone close to his inner circle. The piece framed him as reckless, irresponsible, impulsive, all the things he had tried for years not to be. The girl's situation was sensationalized, their ages printed, their existence turned into a spectacle by people who had no right to speak of them. Anger erupted inside him, not for himself, but for Molly and May. They deserved protection, not exploitation. And in that moment, Brandon knew exactly what Cassandra was capable of and how far she was willing to go. But he also knew something else with absolute certainty: he would fight for his daughters. He would shield them from anyone who tried to turn their lives into collateral damage. And he would not lose them, not now, not ever. The storm had arrived, but for the first time, Brandon wasn't afraid of facing it. He had two little hands to hold and a promise he intended to keep. Brandon expected Cassandra to lash out sooner or later, but the scale of her retaliation unfolded far beyond what he had imagined. Over the next week the media frenzy intensified, fueled by anonymous tips, leaked rumors, and carefully orchestrated whispers from people who clearly wanted to see him cornered. Articles questioned his integrity, his leadership, his emotional stability, and even the legitimacy of the DNA results, spinning wild theories about fraud and manipulation. Some reporters hounded the building where the twins were staying, and Brandon had to hire private security to ensure no one photographed or harassed them. Each time he saw a camera pointed in their direction, his chest tightened with a mix of fury and helplessness. These were children, his children, and yet they were being dragged into a public spectacle they had never asked for. Still, amid the chaos, life with Molly and May began to settle into something warm and surprisingly natural. They started calling him Daddy without hesitation, running to him with absolute trust, drawing pictures of the three of them holding hands under bright suns and smiling clouds. Brandon kept every drawing. They filled a small box on his nightstand, and when he felt overwhelmed by the legal battles or the headlines, he would open it and remind himself why he was fighting. Each bedtime story he read, each giggle he heard echoing through the hallway, each sleepy hug in the morning reminded him that the life he was building with them was real. The rest, the money, the status, the criticism, felt trivial in comparison. But the legal proceedings intensified. Cassandra had hired her own lawyers, claiming Brandon was unfit to take custody until the court could verify the authenticity of the situation. Her team pushed for temporary removal of the children to a neutral state facility, arguing that someone, emotionally compromised and easily manipulated, should not be responsible for vulnerable minors. When Patricia, Brandon's lawyer, read that document aloud in her office, Brandon felt as though the air had been punched from his lungs. The idea of Molly and May being taken from him, even temporarily, was unbearable. Patricia placed a calm hand on his arm and assured him that they would fight this aggressively, but she didn't sugarcoat the difficulty ahead. Cassandra is using every connection she has, she said. She wants to destroy your credibility because she couldn't control the situation. We'll push back, but you need to be ready for a long road. The blow landed not only on him but on the twins as well. They sensed the tension in the adults' voices and the sudden need for extra security around them. One night, after reading them a story, Brandon stood to turn off the lights when Molly's trembling voice stopped him. "Daddy," she whispered, barely audible. "Are they going to take us away?" His heart fractured all over again. He sat on the edge of their bed and gathered both girls close. "No," he said, steady and warm despite the pain in his chest. "No one is taking you from me. I promise you that. I will protect you, always. Nothing and no one will separate us." May burrowed into his side, nodding fiercely as though forcing herself to believe him. Molly only whispered, "Please don't let them," and Brandon stroked her hair until she fell asleep, her tiny hand curled around his finger. The next day, Patricia suggested bringing in character witnesses, people who could confirm Brandon's integrity, his stability, and his commitment to the twins. Mrs. Doyle agreed immediately, offering emotional accounts of Amelia's final months and her certainty that Brandon was the only person she trusted to raise her children. Some of Brandon's colleagues vouched for his leadership and reputation, though a few withdrew support when Cassandra's influence pressured them. Still, a few stood firm, showing him a loyalty he hadn't expected from the corporate world. But what mattered most was the girls' testimony. Though the court was cautious about involving children directly, a specialist was assigned to speak with them privately, evaluating their emotional attachment to Brandon and their level of comfort in his care. Brandon spent the entire day sick with worry as the evaluation took place. When the specialist finally emerged, she approached him with a gentle smile. "They love you," she said simply. "They feel safe with you. And most importantly, they believe you will protect them. Children don't lie about things like that." The relief that washed through him was so powerful he had to steady himself against a wall. He thanked her, though the words felt too small for the gratitude he felt. But the real turning point happened unexpectedly one rainy afternoon. Brandon was reviewing documents with Patricia when Mrs. Doyle called in a panic, saying the twins had found something Amelia had hidden inside an old hardcover book she had kept near her bed. Brandon drove to her house immediately, his mind racing as he imagined what else Amelia might have left behind. Molly and May were waiting for him in the living room, clutching a small, worn book with wide eyes. "We were looking at Mommy's things," May explained softly. "And this fell out." Inside the book was a sealed envelope, addressed in Amelia's handwriting. "To my daughter's father." Brandon sank onto the couch, his breath catching. His hands shook as he opened the envelope and unfolded the pages inside. Amelia's handwriting streamed across the paper in long, elegant strokes, filled with honesty and pain and a love so fierce he could feel it pressing through every word. She explained everything: how she discovered she was pregnant after they parted, how she considered reaching out but feared disrupting his flourishing career, how she watched from afar as he rose in the corporate world and convinced herself he had chosen a life where she didn't belong. She wrote about her illness, her fear of leaving the girls alone, and her belief that he was the only person who could give them the childhood she dreamed of. She included medical documents, photos of her pregnancies, and even a brief message addressed directly to the court, begging them not to separate the girls from their father. The letter was a miracle. It was undeniable proof of Amelia's intentions, her trust, and Brandon's rightful place in the girls' lives. When he finished reading, tears blurred his vision. Molly and May climbed into his lap, pressing their faces against his chest as though sensing the weight of the moment. Mrs. Doyle stood quietly nearby, her eyes misty. Patricia read the letter twice, her expression shifting from awe to fierce determination. "This changes everything," she said. "Cassandra's case just fell apart." Brandon exhaled a breath he'd been holding since the day the twins appeared at that restaurant. He kissed the tops of their heads and whispered, "Your mom saved us again." Outside, the rain eased, and soft sunlight began to break through the clouds. For the first time in weeks, the future didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a doorway, one that was finally opening. Brandon walked into the courtroom with Molly holding his left hand and May holding his right, their small fingers wrapped tightly around his as if afraid he might disappear if they loosened their grip. The air buzzed with tension, reporters hovered outside like circling vultures, and the rows of unfamiliar faces inside seemed to press in from every direction. Yet despite the chaos, Brandon felt an unusual calm settle in his chest. He had Amelia's letter. He had the DNA results. He had the truth, and he had the two little girls who mattered more than anything else in the world. Today, he would not hide, and he would not bend. Today, he would fight. Cassandra sat on the opposing side of the courtroom, her posture immaculate, her expression carved from ice. Her legal team surrounded her like a shield, whispering strategies into her ears, but her eyes never left Brandon. There was a flicker of something like disbelief in her gaze, disbelief that the man she once controlled now stood unshaken, unmoved by her attempts to dismantle him. She crossed her arms as if bracing for war, confident that she still held the upper hand. The judge entered, calling the room to order, and Brandon's lawyer, Patricia Morrison, rose first. With measured confidence she laid out the facts, the DNA tests confirming paternity beyond any doubt, the detailed letter from Amelia written for the express purpose of guiding future guardianship, the documentation of Amelia's illness, and the testimony of Mrs. Doyle, who had witnessed firsthand the mother's final wishes. Patricia spoke not with theatrics but with quiet precision, every sentence building a foundation that felt solid and unshakable. When she read Amelia's letter aloud in the courtroom, a profound silence fell over the room. Amelia's words carried such sincerity and heartbreak that even the judge's expression softened. Brandon felt his throat tighten as he listened to her describe the love she had for their daughters, the pain of leaving them, and the trust she placed in him. Molly and May looked up at him with wide, watery eyes, not fully understanding the legal significance of the letter but sensing the weight of their mother's voice filling the air. By the time Patricia finished, the courtroom felt different, less adversarial, more human. Cassandra's lawyer stood next, his tone sharp and defensive, insisting that the girls needed a neutral environment, that Brandon's sudden appearance in their lives created emotional instability, that the court should consider the optics, the public scrutiny, the potential manipulation involved. But the argument sounded flimsy in the shadow of Amelia's handwritten truth. Cassandra herself took the stand, delivering a carefully rehearsed plea about protecting Brandon from scandal and ensuring that he wasn't taken advantage of by an unexpected situation. Yet the judge noticed what Brandon had sensed for weeks: her words lacked warmth, lacked compassion, lacked even a hint of genuine concern for the children at the center of the case. When Brandon took the stand, the girls sat quietly behind him under Mrs. Doyle's gentle watch. He answered the attorney's questions steadily, though his heart pounded with every one. He spoke about the day the twins approached him in the restaurant, about how the truth unfolded, about the mistakes he had made in the past with Amelia. He admitted openly that he had not been there, but he expressed with quiet conviction that he intended to be there now. He described Molly's fear of being taken away, May's bravery masking her grief, the way the girls clung to each other at night, and his determination to give them stability, comfort, and a home where they would never feel alone again. Then Patricia asked the question he dreaded but knew was necessary: why should the court trust that you are prepared to care for these children? Brandon paused, letting the silence settle. Because they are mine, he said finally, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Not because of a DNA test, though that matters. But because the moment they looked at me, I knew I had already failed them once by not being there when they needed me. I won't fail them again. Everything in my life, my career, my reputation, my plans, can change. But my devotion to them will not. I want to raise them. I want to honor their mother's trust. I want to give them the childhood she dreamed of for them. And I will spend the rest of my life proving that I deserve the chance. The courtroom remained silent long after he finished speaking. Cassandra looked furious, but beneath the anger was something else: fear that she had finally lost control. The judge called a recess, taking time to deliberate, and during that break Brandon returned to the bench where the twins waited. They climbed onto his lap immediately, clinging to him with small hands that trembled. Molly whispered, "Are we going home with you?" and Brandon kissed the top of her head. "Yes," he murmured. "I promise you, yes." When everyone returned to their seats, the judge delivered the decision with clarity and compassion. Full legal custody would be granted to Brandon Hale. Effective immediately. The words washed over him like a warm tide, carrying exhaustion, relief, and joy all at once. Molly and May gasped softly, then burst into quiet smiles that bloomed into tears. Brandon pulled them close, hardly able to breathe through the overwhelming emotion surging through him. Mrs. Doyle wiped her eyes. Patricia allowed herself a rare smile. Cassandra stood rigid and pale, her expression shattering as she realized the battle was lost. When the court adjourned, reporters crowded outside, shouting questions, flashing cameras. Brandon held each girl's hand firmly and navigated through the chaos with calm determination. He shielded their faces from the cameras, guiding them into the waiting car where privacy awaited. Once the doors closed and the noise faded, May leaned against him with a soft sigh of relief while Molly rested her head on his shoulder, exhausted from the ordeal. They drove to the new house he had purchased, a warm, sunlit home with a big yard and rooms prepared specifically for them. He had decorated the bedrooms with their favorite colors, filled their shelves with books and art supplies, and stocked the kitchen with the snacks they loved. When the girls stepped inside, their eyes widened, awe softening every feature. Brandon watched them explore, their small feet padding across the floors, their laughter echoing through the space that was now theirs. That night, after tucking them into their beds and turning out the lights, Brandon lingered in the hallway, listening to the quiet rhythm of their breathing. The house felt alive for the first time, alive with possibility, hope, and love he had never experienced so deeply. Amelia's picture hung in the hallway as a silent reminder of the woman who had brought them into the world and trusted him with their future. As Brandon stood there in the dim light, he realized his life had irrevocably transformed. The man who once chased perfection now chased bedtime giggles, small hands wrapped around his own, and the simple joy of knowing that he had a purpose far greater than any success he had achieved before. The storm had passed. The truth had anchored him. And in the quiet of their new home, surrounded by the daughters he was finally allowed to call his own, Brandon understood that this messy, complicated, beautiful life, was his true beginning.